Some rooms are built to keep secrets. This one was built to keep a promise. Nobody in Blackwood Manor spoke above a whisper when Damien Blackwood crossed the marble foyer with the young Omega walking a few careful steps behind him. The silence had nothing to do with fear alone. It came from disbelief. Their boss, the Alpha whose name made powerful men rethink their decisions, had returned from what everyone assumed was another routine business trip. Instead of bringing home new allies or difficult negotiations, he had arrived with a quiet stranger carrying nothing but a worn backpack and tired eyes that seemed to expect disappointment before kindness. Ethan Carter kept his gaze lowered, unsure whether he was standing inside the safest place he had ever seen or the most dangerous. The towering estate overlooked acres of evergreen forest, its windows glowing warmly against the fading evening sky, but none of that eased the tightness in his chest. He had learned long ago that beautiful places could hide painful memories just as easily as broken ones. The head butler stepped forward with perfect posture. "Sir, shall I prepare one of the guest rooms?" Damien didn't even slow his pace. No, his answer was calm enough to make everyone listen even harder. "Open the room on the 3rd floor." For the first time in years, composure cracked across the staff's faces. A maid quietly covered her mouth. One of the security officers exchanged a stunned glance with another. The 3rd floor room had remained untouched for as long as anyone could remember. It was cleaned every week, fresh flowers appeared without explanation, and no one was ever allowed to enter without Damien himself unlocking the door. Rumors had grown around it like ivy. Some believed it belonged to a lost family member. Others thought it held memories too painful to revisit. No one knew the truth because no one had ever been invited inside. Damien climbed the staircase without another word. Ethan followed, feeling every curious stare on his back. He wanted to ask why everyone looked so shocked, but experience had taught him that questions often earn trouble. At the end of the hallway, Damien stopped. Before a polished walnut door. He reached into his pocket, removed a silver key attached to a leather strap softened by years of use, and unlocked it with deliberate care. Warm light spilled into the hallway. The room beyond felt less like a bedroom and more like a place waiting patiently for someone to return. Books lined handcrafted shelves. A reading chair rested beside a wide window overlooking the pine trees. A soft navy blanket covered the bed, and fresh lilies filled the air with a gentle fragrance. Nothing looked new, yet nothing felt forgotten. It was as though every detail had been preserved for a single purpose. Ethan remained frozen at the doorway. "There must be some mistake," he said quietly. "This can't be for me." Damien turned toward him, his expression unreadable but his voice unexpectedly gentle. "From today forward," he said, placing the old silver key into Ethan's trembling hand, "this room is yours." As the cool metal settled against Ethan's palm, every person watching from the hallway realized they had witnessed something impossible. None of them understood why the most guarded Alpha in the city had entrusted his greatest secret to a stranger. Only Damien knew that this room had never been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for Ethan. The heavy wooden door closed with a quiet click behind Ethan, sealing away the curious eyes that had followed him through the hallway. For several long moments he simply stood in the center of the room, unable to move. Everything around him felt impossibly untouched, as though someone had spent years protecting every book, every blanket, every piece of furniture from the passing of time. He slowly set his faded backpack beside the bed, almost embarrassed by how worn it looked against the carefully arranged space. His fingers brushed across the smooth oak desk before drifting toward the bookshelf. None of the novels looked random. Some were classics he had borrowed from public libraries years ago because he could never afford to buy them. Others were quiet stories about hope and second chances that few people ever recommended. He frowned. It was too strange to dismiss as coincidence. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. The butler entered with a silver tray carrying hot tea, homemade bread, fresh fruit, and a bowl of soup that filled the room with a comforting aroma. He placed everything on the small table near the window before offering a respectful nod. "If there is anything you need, Mr. Carter, please let us know." Ethan blinked in surprise. "You know my name." The older man smiled politely. Everyone in the house does. Before Ethan could ask another question, the butler quietly excused himself, leaving behind more questions than answers. Downstairs, however, silence had already turned into whispers. Several members of Damien's trusted staff gathered in the kitchen, speaking carefully so their voices would not travel through the halls. He gave away the third-floor room, one maid whispered. "I have worked here for 12 years. I have never even stepped inside." Another employee lowered his voice even further. "Do you remember when Mr. Holloway asked about that room 3 years ago?" Everyone nodded. Damien had simply replied that the room belonged to someone important. Nobody had dared ask who that person was. Yet today, without hesitation, he had handed the key to a stranger. In his private office, Damien stood before the large windows overlooking the forest. His longtime advisor, Victor Hayes, entered carrying a leather folder but never opened it. "You understand what everyone is saying," Victor began carefully. Damien remained silent. "They believe your judgment has changed." Damien finally turned around. "Has it?" Victor hesitated. "No. That is exactly why they are confused." Damien walked to his desk and rested one hand against the polished wood. "Good. Let them remain confused." Victor studied his old friend for a long moment. During more than 15 years of working together, he had seen Damien negotiate impossible agreements, solve crises with remarkable patience, and protect countless people who depended on him. But he had never seen this expression before. It was not relief. It was not happiness. It looked almost like someone who had finally reached the end of a very long journey. Upstairs, Ethan wandered toward the wide window, overlooking rows of towering pine trees stretching beyond the estate. The view was peaceful enough that he could almost forget how exhausted he felt. His attention shifted to a small wooden box resting neatly on the bookshelf. He hesitated before opening it. Inside was a simple brass bookmark shaped like a feather and a handwritten note containing only 4 words. "For when you return." Ethan read the sentence again. There was no signature. No date. His heartbeat quickened. Return. The word lingered in his mind because it suggested someone had always expected another person to come back. But he had never been here before. At least, that was what he believed. A soft breeze drifted through the partially open window, carrying the scent of pine and summer rain. Ethan carefully returned the bookmark and closed the box exactly as he had found it. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet feeling he could not explain began to grow. It was not trust. It was not certainty. It was the unsettling sense that this room somehow knew him long before he had ever crossed its doorway, and for the first time in many years, Damien Blackwood was not the only person beginning to wonder whether the past had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The following morning arrived with soft sunlight filtering through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across the hardwood floor. Ethan woke slowly, confused for a brief moment by the unfamiliar comfort surrounding him. The mattress had been softer than anything he could remember sleeping on, yet what surprised him most was not the luxury. It was the uninterrupted silence. No shouting. No hurried footsteps outside his door. No anxious feeling that someone would suddenly tell him to leave. For the first time in years, he had slept through the entire night. He sat on the edge of the bed and noticed neatly folded clothes resting on a chair nearby. A simple cream sweater, dark jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a lightweight jacket in exactly his size. There was no note explaining who had placed them there. Ethan looked toward the closed door, wondering if this had been another mistake. After changing, he hesitated before leaving the room. The hallway remained quiet, but every employee he passed greeted him with the same respectful smile. No one stared. No one asked uncomfortable questions. Their politeness almost made him more nervous because it felt completely unfamiliar. Following the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries, Ethan eventually found the dining room. A long wooden table overlooked the gardens through floor-to-ceiling windows. Damien was already there, reading several documents while a cup of black coffee rested untouched beside him. Without looking up, he spoke in the same calm voice Ethan had heard the day before. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." Ethan nodded carefully before realizing Damien was still reading. Yes. Better than I expected." Damien closed the folder and finally met his eyes. "Good. Sit down before breakfast gets cold." Ethan quietly took the chair across from him. He expected an elaborate meal fit for a wealthy household, but instead he found scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, toasted sourdough, oatmeal with blueberries, and herbal tea instead of coffee waiting at his place. His eyes widened slightly. "Is something wrong?" Damien asked. Ethan looked at the tea. "No. I just usually drink herbal tea in the morning." A faint smile almost appeared on Damien's face. "I know." Ethan froze. "How?" Damien simply reached for his coffee. "You should eat." The answer never came. Throughout breakfast, Damien returned to reviewing paperwork while Ethan slowly finished every bite. The silence should have felt uncomfortable, yet somehow it did not. It felt peaceful, as though neither of them needed to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Across the room, however, Victor Hayes observed everything from a respectful distance. He noticed details others overlooked. Damien had instructed the chef to prepare lighter meals because Ethan often skipped breakfast when anxious. The guest bathroom beside the third-floor room had already been stocked with unscented soap, fragrance-free shampoo, and the exact brand of tea now sitting on the table. None of those choices could have been guessed after only one evening. They had been planned long before Ethan ever entered Blackwood Manor. Later that afternoon, Ethan wandered into the estate library. Sunlight poured across rows of books stretching from floor to ceiling, creating a peaceful warmth that invited him to stay. As he browsed the shelves, his hand stopped on a familiar novel that had comforted him during difficult years. He gently pulled it free. A small piece of paper slipped from between the pages and floated onto the carpet. Ethan bent down to pick it up. It was an old library checkout receipt dated almost 8 years earlier. The title matched the very book now resting in his hands. Scribbled across the back was a short sentence written in neat handwriting. "He always chooses this one when he needs hope." Ethan read the words twice before slowly looking around the empty library. His heartbeat became noticeably faster. No one could have known something so personal unless they had been watching him years ago. Before he could gather his thoughts, Damien appeared quietly at the entrance. He had not spoken a single word, yet his presence somehow felt reassuring instead of startling. Ethan held up the note with uncertain fingers. "Who wrote this?" Damien's gaze rested on the faded paper for a long moment before returning to Ethan. Someone who believed memories should never disappear. It was another answer that explained almost nothing, but this time Ethan noticed something different. Damien was no longer avoiding the truth. He was guiding Ethan toward it one careful step at a time, as though revealing everything too soon might cause the fragile bridge between yesterday and a forgotten past to collapse before either of them was ready to cross it. That evening a gentle rain settled over Blackwood Manor, tapping softly against the tall windows as the estate grew quieter. Ethan had begun to recognize the rhythm of the house. The staff moved with calm efficiency, meals appeared at the same time every day, and Damien seemed to disappear into meetings before returning just before dinner without ever appearing rushed. It was a peaceful routine, yet beneath its calm surface Ethan sensed an invisible tension that no one spoke about. Every time he entered a room, conversations paused for the briefest moment before continuing as though nothing had happened. No one treated him poorly. In fact, everyone treated him with remarkable respect. Somehow that only deepened the mystery. Late in the afternoon Ethan wandered into the greenhouse beside the eastern garden, drawn by rows of blooming orchids and climbing ivy. The warm air smelled of fresh soil and rosemary. As he admired the flowers, 2 gardeners entered from the opposite side, unaware that he stood behind a wall of hanging ferns. "Do you think he knows?" one of them whispered. The older gardener slowly shook his head. "Not yet." "Then why would Mr. Blackwood finally open that room now?" "Because if our employer waited this long, he must have had a reason." I heard the room has been ready for years. Longer than that. Ethan held his breath. Their footsteps faded before he could hear anything else. He stepped back into the main garden, his thoughts growing heavier with every passing minute. Everything pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. Someone had expected him to arrive long before he knew Blackwood Manor even existed. Across the estate, Damien was meeting with Victor Hayes inside the study. Several reports lay neatly organized across the desk, but Victor noticed that Damien had not turned a single page. "You are distracted," Victor observed. Damien glanced toward the rain beyond the windows. He heard them talking. Victor sighed quietly. The staff is trying their best, but curiosity spreads quickly. Damien nodded once. Then remind everyone that Ethan is a guest, not a subject for speculation. They are not questioning him, Victor replied carefully. They are questioning you. Damien looked back at his advisor. That changes nothing. Victor folded his hands. May I ask something as your friend instead of your advisor? Damien gave a slight nod. If Ethan remembers everything before you are ready to explain it yourself, what happens then? For the first time that day, uncertainty crossed Damien's expression. It disappeared almost immediately, but Victor had known him too long to miss it. Then I will tell him the truth, Damien answered quietly. Every part of it. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the library hoping that familiar books might calm the growing storm inside his mind. Instead, his attention settled on an old globe resting beside the fireplace. Tiny marks had been made across several states with delicate silver pins connected by thin thread. Curious, he leaned closer. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Colorado, Oregon. They formed a path stretching across the country. Beside the globe rested a leather notebook. Ethan did not open it. Something told him it was personal. Yet as he turned away, a folded photograph slipped from between its pages and landed at his feet. He picked it up instinctively. The picture showed a quiet community fair many years ago. Families smiled beneath colorful banners while children held balloons and cups of lemonade. Nothing seemed unusual until Ethan noticed one corner of the image. There, barely visible in the background, stood a tall teenage boy wearing a dark baseball cap. His face was partly hidden, but he was unmistakably watching a much younger child sitting beneath a large oak tree with an open book resting in his lap. Ethan's breathing slowed. The child looked strangely familiar. Before he could study the picture any longer, Damien entered the library. His eyes immediately settled on the photograph in Ethan's hands. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan looked up. Is this me? Damien did not deny it. He simply walked closer, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had followed him from the very beginning. Yes. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the photograph. Then who was taking the picture? Damien looked at the younger version of himself standing almost unnoticed in the distance before answering with complete honesty. No one was watching you that day, Ethan. He paused just long enough for the meaning of his words to settle. I was looking for you. The words lingered in the quiet library long after Damien stopped speaking. Ethan lowered his eyes to the old photograph once more, searching for something that would prove he had misunderstood. The smiling families, the summer banners, the child beneath the oak tree, and the distant teenager wearing a baseball cap all remained exactly where they had been frozen years before. You were looking for me? Ethan asked softly. Damien nodded once. I was. But we never met. Not the way you remember. Ethan wanted to ask another question, but the sincerity in Damien's voice left him unexpectedly unsettled. There was no hesitation, no attempt to persuade him, only a quiet certainty that seemed rooted in memories Ethan could not reach. Damien carefully took the photograph and slid it back into the leather notebook. You do not have to understand everything today, he said. Some answers are worth waiting for. Ethan followed him out of the library, yet his thoughts refused to settle. Every hallway inside Blackwood Manor now seemed filled with invisible stories. The room prepared years in advance, the handwritten notes, the familiar books, the carefully chosen meals, and now an old photograph that suggested Damien had crossed paths with him long before either of them had spoken a single word. Nothing fit together, yet everything pointed toward the same hidden truth. That evening the rain finally stopped, leaving the gardens covered with tiny drops that reflected the setting sun. Ethan stepped onto the back terrace, hoping the cool air would quiet his mind. From there he noticed Damien walking alone toward a small stone gazebo overlooking the lake. Curious but careful not to interrupt, Ethan remained near the edge of the garden. Damien sat on the wooden bench beneath the gazebo and removed a worn leather wallet from his coat pocket. Instead of checking documents or messages, he quietly unfolded a faded piece of paper that looked much older than the wallet itself. He studied it for several silent minutes with an expression Ethan had never seen before. It was neither sadness nor happiness. It was longing mixed with relief, as though the distance between yesterday and today had finally begun to disappear. Before Ethan could look away, Victor approached the gazebo carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Damien before taking the seat beside him. "You have kept that letter for almost 15 years, Victor said gently. Damien smiled faintly without looking up. Some things should never be thrown away. Does he know? Damien carefully folded the paper and returned it to the wallet. Not yet. Victor watched the peaceful lake. He is beginning to ask the right questions. I know. And when he asks the last one? Damien answered after a thoughtful silence. Then I will stop protecting the past from him. Ethan quietly stepped back before either man noticed him. He had not intended to overhear their conversation, yet one sentence echoed through his thoughts. 15 years. Whatever connected him to Damien had not begun recently. It had existed for nearly half his life. Later that night Ethan returned to his room, unable to sleep. Moonlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the bookshelf beside his bed. Restless, he selected another novel from the shelf, hoping reading would distract him. As he opened the cover, something slipped onto the comforter. It was a small pressed maple leaf, carefully preserved between 2 sheets of wax paper. Tucked beneath it was another handwritten sentence in the same neat handwriting he had already seen before. You smiled even after giving away your last dollar. Ethan frowned. He barely remembered doing something like that as a child. A distant memory surfaced like sunlight breaking through morning fog. A small town festival. A food stand. An elderly musician collecting donations. A young boy deciding that someone else needed help more than he did. The memory vanished before Ethan could hold onto it, but one detail remained strangely vivid. Someone had been standing nearby, quietly watching without saying a word. Ethan slowly closed the book and looked toward the window. Somewhere else in the house Damien was likely still awake, carrying memories that Ethan himself had forgotten. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, Ethan realized the greatest mystery was no longer why Damien had chosen him. The real mystery was why his own heart had begun to feel strangely at home in a place he could not remember ever visiting. Morning arrived beneath a clear blue sky, washing Blackwood Manor in warm light that made the previous night's questions feel almost unreal. Ethan stood on the balcony outside his room with a cup of herbal tea warming his hands, watching a gentle breeze ripple across the lake beyond the gardens. The estate looked peaceful enough to belong in another lifetime, yet his thoughts remained fixed on the fragments of memory that refused to leave him. A photograph. A pressed maple leaf. A sentence written by someone who seemed to know every quiet moment of his childhood. None of it made sense, but the pieces no longer felt random. They felt connected. After breakfast, Damien invited Ethan to take a walk through the western side of the property where old oak trees shaded a narrow stone path leading toward a small glass conservatory that had not been opened in years. Neither of them hurried. The silence between them had slowly become comfortable, no longer demanding constant conversation. Birds sang from the branches overhead while sunlight flickered across the path beneath their feet. Ethan finally spoke. Did you always know I would come here someday? Damien kept his eyes on the trail ahead. I hoped you would. Hope is different from certainty. Yes, Damien answered quietly. Hope survives when certainty disappears. Ethan considered the reply before asking the question that had lingered in his mind since the library. Were you searching for me all those years? Damien stopped beside an old stone fountain where clear water flowed steadily into a shallow basin. He rested one hand on its weathered edge before answering. I searched until I found enough proof that you were safe. Ethan frowned. Then why did you wait? Damien looked at the reflection shimmering across the water. Because there are moments people must reach on their own. If I had entered your life too early, I would have become another stranger making promises you had no reason to believe. Ethan lowered his gaze. Somehow that answer hurt less than he expected. It sounded patient rather than distant. They continued walking until they reached the conservatory. Damien unlocked the door with another old key and gently pushed it open. Inside, sunlight poured through the glass ceiling onto rows of carefully tended plants. In one quiet corner stood a wooden workbench covered with small flower pots, gardening tools, and several journals stacked neatly beside each other. Ethan noticed one clay pot holding a young maple tree no taller than 2 feet. A small brass plaque rested beside it. It simply read, "The day we meet again." Ethan stared at the words in silence. How old is this tree? He finally asked. Damien smiled almost imperceptibly. 14 years. Ethan slowly reached out and touched one of its bright green leaves. Another memory surfaced without warning. A younger version of himself standing beside a tiny maple sapling at a community garden. Someone beside him saying that trees remembered kindness because they grew toward the people who cared for them. He could not remember the face. He could not remember the voice. But he remembered laughing. The memory disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only the warmth behind. Damien noticed the change in Ethan's expression. Did you remember something? Ethan nodded faintly. Only a feeling. Damien's voice remained gentle. Sometimes feelings return before memories do. As they prepared to leave, Ethan's attention shifted toward one of the journals on the workbench. Its cover had faded with age, but a familiar feather-shaped brass bookmark rested inside. Damien picked it up without hesitation and handed it to Ethan. You should read this when you are ready. Ethan accepted the journal carefully. What is it? Damien looked toward the young maple tree before answering. It is a record of every place I searched, every lead that disappeared, every reason I refused to stop believing that one day I would find the boy who taught me that kindness could change the course of a life. Ethan's heart skipped. His fingers tightened around the journal, but before he could open it, a folded envelope slipped from between its pages and drifted onto the wooden floor. Across the front, written in the same careful handwriting Ethan had come to recognize, were 6 simple words that instantly stole his breath. To Ethan, when he remembers me. The envelope rested quietly in Ethan's hands, yet it felt heavier than anything he had carried in years. He traced the familiar handwriting with his fingertips, almost afraid that opening it would shatter the fragile certainty he had slowly begun to build inside Blackwood Manor. He looked toward Damien, silently asking for permission without speaking. Damien gave a single gentle nod. It belongs to you. Ethan carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. The ink had faded with time, but every word remained perfectly readable. If this letter ever reaches you, then life has already given me something I once believed impossible. You may not remember my face, and that is all right. I only hope that somewhere inside your heart, kindness still feels familiar. You once told a lonely boy that people do not become stronger by standing alone. They become stronger when someone chooses to stay. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I would become the person who stayed. Ethan stopped reading. His vision blurred as an unexpected wave of emotion swept through him. He did not remember writing those words into someone else's life, yet something deep inside him recognized them. They sounded like the child he had once been before disappointment had taught him to expect less from the world. He slowly lowered the letter. You wrote this? Damien nodded. The night before I left my hometown. Ethan looked at him in disbelief. You kept it all these years? Every day. They stood together in the quiet conservatory while sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling above them. The young maple tree swayed gently in the breeze coming through an open window, almost as though time itself had paused to listen. Ethan finally asked the question that had lived between them since the first day. Why me? Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the workbench and rested his hand beside the small maple tree. Most people remember important moments because someone saved them, he began softly. My life changed because someone believed I was worth saving before I believed it myself. Ethan remained silent. Damien continued. When I was 19, I had already learned how to hide every feeling behind responsibility. My family expected perfection. Everyone respected the name I carried, but very few saw the person beneath it. One afternoon I wandered into a community fair simply to escape the noise for a while. He smiled faintly at the memory. There was a young boy sitting beneath an oak tree with a library book in his lap. An elderly musician nearby was trying to collect enough donations to repair his old violin. People walked past without stopping. Then that little boy quietly placed the only dollar he had into the donation box. Ethan's breathing slowed. The image returned with startling clarity. The music. The sunlight. The old violin case. Damien looked directly into his eyes. Later that afternoon I found you sitting alone, reading the same book that now rests on your shelf upstairs. I asked why you had given away your lunch money to someone you had never met. Ethan whispered the answer before he even realized he remembered it. Because maybe he needed hope more than I needed lunch. Damien smiled for the first time without restraint. Those were your exact words. Ethan closed his eyes. More memories surfaced like pieces of a forgotten melody. A shy teenage boy sitting beside him beneath the oak tree. Quiet conversations about books. A promise that they would both become people who never ignored someone in need. He remembered sharing half of his sandwich because the older boy had admitted he had skipped breakfast. He remembered laughter. He remembered kindness. And then life had carried them in different directions. Damien's voice remained calm. I did not build that room because I felt sorry for you. I built it because I made myself a promise long ago. If I ever found you again, there would always be one place in this world where you would never have to wonder whether you belonged. Ethan looked around the conservatory, then back toward the manor standing proudly beyond the gardens. Suddenly every unexplained detail found its place. The room, the books, the tea, the notes, the maple tree, the preserved memories. None of them had been accidents. They had all been quiet promises waiting for the day he finally returned. Ethan folded the letter carefully and held it close to his heart. I remember the oak tree now, he whispered. Damien's eye softened with unmistakable relief. Then perhaps, he replied, you are finally ready to hear the one part of the story I have never written down. The conservatory fell completely silent after Damien's words. Ethan stood motionless, the carefully folded letter still resting against his chest while memories continued to surface one gentle wave at a time. They were no longer scattered fragments. They were becoming a story. He remembered the community fair beneath the old oak tree. He remembered sharing books with the quiet teenager who always listened more than he spoke. He remembered promising that no matter where life carried them, kindness would always find its way back to the people who needed it most. What he could not remember was how they had become strangers. Damien slowly walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the gardens. The year after we met, he said softly, my family moved across the country. Everything happened faster than I expected. I returned to the community center every summer after that, hoping you would be there again. Ethan watched him carefully. But I never came back. Damien nodded. The librarian told me your foster family had relocated. No one knew where. Ethan lowered his eyes. The word foster echoed through memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Different schools. Different houses. Different towns. Every move had made it easier to believe that lasting connections belonged to other people. I searched anyway, Damien continued. At first I believed it would take a few months. Then I believed it would take a few years. Eventually I stopped counting the time and simply continued looking whenever I found another lead. Ethan remembered the globe in the library marked with silver pins stretching across the United States. Those cities, he whispered. They were all places where someone thought I might be. Yes. You traveled to every one of them. Damien answered with quiet honesty. Some leads lasted a day. Others lasted months. Most ended with another closed door. Ethan felt an unexpected ache settle in his chest. While he had been trying to survive, one uncertain chapter after another, someone else had quietly refused to let the memory of him disappear. Damien reached into his jacket and removed a small leather card holder. Inside was an old library card with worn edges. Ethan immediately recognized the name printed across the front. It was his own childhood library card, complete with a photograph of a smiling boy several years younger. Ethan stared at it in astonishment. How do you have this? Damien smiled gently. The librarian found it after your family moved. She remembered how often we sat together reading in the afternoons. Before the building closed for renovations, she gave it to me and said that if anyone could return it, it would probably be the boy who never stopped asking where you had gone. Ethan carefully accepted the card. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was a simple motto from the old library. Every story deserves its ending. He laughed quietly through eyes that had begun to shine with emotion. I cannot believe you kept something this small for all these years. Damien looked at him with calm certainty. It was never small to me. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the open conservatory doors. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt like two unfinished chapters finally finding the same page. Ethan broke the quiet first. When I arrived here, I believed you had chosen me because you felt sorry for me. Damien slowly shook his head. Pity fades. Promises do not. He took a measured breath before continuing. The world sees me as someone who makes difficult decisions without hesitation. They assume I chose you in a single moment. The truth is much simpler. I made that choice 15 years ago beneath an oak tree when a boy I had just met reminded me that kindness could outlive fear, distance, and time. Ethan looked around the conservatory once more, noticing how every carefully preserved memory now formed one complete picture. The room upstairs had never been prepared for a stranger. The books had never been random. The meals had never been guesses. Every thoughtful detail had been an expression of one promise quietly, honored year after year. As they stepped outside together, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone path leading back toward Blackwood Manor. Ethan slipped the library card beside Damien's letter and held both close, realizing that for the first time in many years he was no longer searching for where he belonged. He had finally found the person who had been waiting for him all along, and neither of them knew that one final surprise still remained inside the room that had always carried his name. As the sun slowly settled behind the tall pines surrounding Blackwood Manor, the estate seemed quieter than it had ever been. The endless questions that had followed Ethan since the day he arrived had finally found their answers, yet an unfamiliar peace had taken their place. For years he had believed that every goodbye was permanent and every safe place was temporary. Now, for the first time, he wondered what it felt like to stop preparing to leave. Damien walked beside him through the grand entrance hall without saying a word. Neither of them needed to fill the silence anymore. It had become the comfortable silence of two people who no longer carry their memories alone. When they reached the third floor, Damien stopped outside the familiar walnut door. Ethan smiled softly. I already know this room is mine. Damien returned the smile. There is one more thing you have never seen. He unlocked the door, allowing Ethan to step inside first. Everything looked exactly as it had before, from the bookshelves to the reading chair beside the window. But this time Damien walked past the bed and gently opened a narrow cabinet built into the far wall. Hidden inside was a simple wooden keepsake box that Ethan had never noticed before. Damien lifted it carefully and placed it into Ethan's hands. "I thought this belonged here until the day you came home." Ethan slowly opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of small reminders collected across 15 years. A faded ticket from the community fair where they first met. A pressed maple leaf nearly identical to the one hidden inside the novel. A newspaper clipping announcing that the old neighborhood library had reopened after renovations. A tiny handcrafted wooden bookmark shaped like an oak leaf. There were postcards from cities Damien had visited while following uncertain leads, each dated years apart. None of them had ever been mailed. Instead, every card began with the same greeting. "Dear Ethan, today I thought I was one step closer to finding you." Ethan carefully picked up the oldest postcard. The handwriting was younger, less steady than the recent letters, but the hope inside every sentence remained unchanged. Another postcard read, "I found another address today. It was not yours, but I will keep looking." A third one simply said, "Wherever life has taken you, I hope someone reminded you that you matter." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, overcome not by sadness but by the extraordinary patience behind every unwritten message. "You never stopped talking to me," he whispered. Damien gently shook his head. "Even when I had nowhere to send the words." Ethan looked around the room one last time before returning his attention to the keepsake box. "You called this home before I ever arrived." Damien nodded. A house becomes a home because of the person you hope will walk through the door. He reached into his pocket and placed the familiar silver key onto Ethan's open palm once again. This time he did not let go immediately. "Years ago I promised myself that if I ever found you again, you would never have to earn your place in my life. You already had one." Ethan looked down at the key, remembering how uncertain he had felt the first time it rested in his hand. Back then it had represented confusion. Now it represented trust, belonging, and a promise that had quietly survived across half a lifetime. He slipped the key into his pocket beside the library card and Damien's letter, knowing those three small objects carried more meaning than anything money could ever buy. As evening settled over Blackwood Manor, the staff noticed something they had never expected to witness. Ethan no longer walked through the halls like a cautious guest afraid of taking up space. He greeted the house with an easy smile, stopping to thank the chef for dinner, compliment the gardeners on the blooming roses, and share a quiet conversation with the butler who had welcomed him on his first morning. The atmosphere of the estate changed almost imperceptibly, as though the home itself had been waiting for that smile to return. Later, standing together beside the window overlooking the moonlit lake, Ethan spoke the words Damien had dreamed of hearing for 15 years. "I think I finally understand why this room always felt familiar." Damien looked toward him with quiet curiosity. Ethan smiled warmly. "It was never waiting for a stranger. It was waiting for me to remember that I already belonged somewhere." Damien's expression softened with a peace that no achievement or success had ever given him. Outside, the young maple tree swayed gently beneath the evening breeze, its branches reaching higher than they had the season before. Like every promise faithfully kept, it had continued growing even when no one was there to watch. And inside the room that had been built from hope rather than certainty, two lives that had once drifted apart finally found the ending they had been quietly writing for each other all along.